So we are going to go ahead and get started. And Makalika isn't on the call yet. I know she is tuning in very early from Hawaii, so she might be hopping on the call. But if anything, Gail and I will have an awesome conversation today. But I'll go ahead and introduce both the panelists. So, Gayle Karen Young is a culture builder and catalyst for human and organizational development. She comes from a rich cultural organizational consulting background with both corporate and nonprofit clients. Her clients have ranged from McDonald's Corporation to Kaiser Permanente to Yale University. Gayle is passionate about global women's issues and supporting women in leadership. She has worked as a facilitator for the Stanford Graduate School of Business Interpersonal Dynamics course and their Women in Management program, and mentors for programs such as the Unreasonable Institute and Singularity University. She is keenly interested in the intersection of technology and human rights and supports democracy movements at home and abroad. So Makalika Naholowa'a is a Native Hawaiian lawyer and advocate for Indigenous peoples. She serves as executive director of the Native Hawaiian Legal Corps and is the only firm in the world dedicated to Native Hawaiian rights. Founded in 1974, the NHLC represents Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners, families, and communities in matters spanning environmental law, land use, housing, federal and state constitutional rights, and the protection of traditional knowledge and cultural intellectual property. Makalika has practiced law for more than 15 years with a background spanning Indigenous rights, intellectual property, and technology. Makalika is a haumana of renowned Ho'oponopono practitioner Kumu Lynette Paglina. And just letting you all know, that was just a snippet of both of their bios. Both have amazing insights and background that I hope that we will get to chat more about today. But Gayle, thank you so much for being here. Can you let us know? So right before the call, Renee and I were talking about, I wonder where Gayle will be tuning in from today, because I feel like you're always traveling and worldwide, but where are you tuning in from today?
This morning, I'm tuning in from Austin, Texas, where I'm working with a foundation on learning and rural youth education here in the state. So, again, the privilege working with a large variety of clients doing some interesting work.
Amazing. One question that we always start out with is, what does thriving mean to you, both professionally and personally?
At some point, I made and I still question myself on this one sometimes, the decision to choose a life of fullness over happiness. And so, thriving for me is about fullness. It's when I get to have in a life a full range of experiences available to me, from the beauty of the small joys, when I'm able to have the capacity to notice beauty. There's a Zen koan. I'm trained in the Zen tradition for 15 years and in Upaya's Zen chaplaincy program. And a piece of that is there's this old koan about the difference between heaven and hell. And hell is when you can't hear bird song. When you are so moving through the world, you're preoccupied, your attention is hijacked, it's in your devices, whatever it is. The things that are worth noticing, the beauty of a day, the way sunlight is, the way wind feels on their skin, the call of bird song, when that is unavailable to you for whatever reason. So thriving includes of life a bit, being able to feel that and being able to direct my attention and to play with people that matter. So thriving includes for me a wealth of relational gifts, of deep friendship, of movement, um, and um, and it also is deeply embedded in community thriving. I think it is very hard. We over rotate, and let me know if I go off too long because I have a lot of opinions on these topics. Um, but I think we over rotate on thriving as such an individual thing. Like, that if you sleep enough, if you eat well enough, if you do X, Y, and Z, you will be well. And we are not well unless our people are well. Our community, it's very hard to do well if you have a loved one who's in deep suffering, for example. So I think it's important to locate that there's some element of thriving that lives very much in the individual. And there's a lot of elements of thriving that also exist as an extension of our interrelatedness into the worlds that we exist in, the people we love, the communities we love, the nature we love, the planet we love. And so I just want to name that thriving has a much wider location for me, which sometimes makes it a little harder some days because this world has a lot going on. Let's just say that for the
Yeah.
moment.
Absolutely. And I feel like since stepping into my role with Wisdom Works, I have really expanded what I thought thriving meant to me. And then applying that in kind of like a leadership context as well has also been expanded. But I really love what you said about just noticing just the little things. Awe and appreciation is something that we talk about a lot at Wisdom Works and how that's an element of thriving. So I really appreciate you saying that. And I was wondering, have you had a recent moment of that aspect of play in your community that has just enhanced your thriving just in recent days or weeks?
I just went through a stretch of like, I think like 12 straight days of all day meetings just because my consulting firm that I'm a part of met back to back. And then the leadership team on my consulting firm met after the main consulting firm did. And so I am a fan of the good occasional dance party. Like it's sometimes you just need that palate cleanser where you have somebody put on a really good piece of music and we're just going to dance this out in a moment. And so sometimes I am sometimes astonished that it's sometimes not as far away as we think it is. There's ways you can feel, especially in the stretch of a day that's tired or has a lot of travel or just has a lot of tough conversations in it, that it can feel far away. And then I'm astonished about how something can break through a text from a loved one, a little bit of a dance party, a really good song coming on, an interaction, seeing a beloved person's face. I see my friend Cheyenne on this call, so that makes me super happy. So just even letting that in. And I think we get so armored sometimes we forget to let those things in.
Absolutely. So you very briefly mentioned it, but you have gone through, I think you said 15 years of Zen practice. And one thing I left out in her bio that I just read is that before you stepped into a high leadership executive role, you were practicing to become a Zen monk. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah,
Did you
that's one of my
Could you talk a little bit more about that and what led you to that practice? And I'm also curious about what do you incorporate from your Zen practice in your everyday leadership in life?
for me, this question, I think it's a very difficult time, as I've said to some of you before, to be a systems thinker and an empath. This is not a great time for it. It's kind of shit. Pardon me, I start swearing a lot and different pieces. And for me, this question of how do we be with it all, right? And not flinch and turn away and not just disengage, which, by the way, I have a lot of compassion for disengaging. I have done it. We've all done it. You know, Netflix looks endlessly great sometimes in some moments, but I really wanted to cultivate the capacity to be with what's hard. And so the Zen tradition was one. I found out that, and I have huge love of all of the wisdom traditions, from the Sufi to the Judaic to the Catholic. I love this. I love the wisdom traditions for what they offer us in this space and the capacity to be contemplative. But the question of how do we be with it all, and to sit with what's hard, really, and to let it in and not turn away. Um, or turn away in moments and then turn back. And so that was the original impetus and curiosity for it. And I have found it to be in good stead. I was Wikipedia CHRO, and the capacity to be a non-anxious presence in an anxious system, I think, is not to be underestimated. What it is to walk with an ordered nervous system at a very fundamental level through spaces where there's a lot of disorder. I spent also a third of my life doing work with pro-democracy activists across a lot of different spaces. And these are people working against deeply asymmetrical power structures. So, um, talking about North Koreans, Iranians, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, who've had their homelands, Cubans. And so really people who work, and a lot of people who've been tortured, incarcerated, et cetera. And so the difference sometimes of being able to help by just sheer being an ordered nervous system, I don't know, to be a grounded presence next to them sets a stage vibe, um, accompaniment, that presence that makes a lot of other things available that might not otherwise be available. And so I have a practice of very deliberately carrying that into the rooms I'm in, and even facilitating today. You ask the question, and then there's the silence, and I like to occasionally remind people that I'm very, very comfortable with letting the silence ride until someone feels impelled to speak.
I am the very same way, Gail, with that silence. There is a question from Renee. That's a good question. How can we bring an ordered nervous system into disordered spaces?
Uh, I think one of the first things for me, and I would be curious to hear what other people do, is to have your own practices for drinking from a deeper well, whatever that is. You know, sometimes when my little niece was a baby, sometimes it would be holding her while she was sleeping because there is nothing like a sleeping infant. My sister would say, especially when they're sleeping. you know, um, my dogs are great. So whatever it is, sometimes also poetry and literature. Like for me, I love poetry for naming the really hard things, the really ineffable things. And so I have a variety of practices that keep me resourced. And I
Mm,
think touching into those very deliberately and not the doom scroll, because the doom scroll is not meant to keep your nervous system calm. It is fun on small occasions, but not meant for that. And so the practices um, and just the somatic regulation that's needed to notice what is going on in a system and be very mindfully counteractive to that as you walk into a room. Wikipedia, I used to walk by a conference room, I'm like, oh, there's something going on in there. Let me, find out. You develop that attuning over time. Did I
mm.
answer the question sufficiently? I'm happy to keep talking.
No, you're good. I've learned a lot over the last few months about breath work and using that as a grounding practice in the moment. And it's such an easy 1 second practice that I can step into whenever I enter that sort of disordered space or environment. And I'm finding myself turning to that a lot these days as I go through all these transitions and things. So, you also mentioned poetry. Gail, fun fact, has a really awesome blog. And you have a great writing practice. So I'm assuming that is also something that you turn to other than to avoid the doom scrolling is the writing practice and grounding yourself in that creative practice.
I do think creativity is a human birthright, whatever form it takes, social creativity, doodling, gardening. I mean, that we are so ready to not allow ourselves our own artistry because we cast it onto other people, or we don't feel like we can claim it ourselves. And so writing has been a relatively new one. I didn't write for 15 years, and it's been a lovely but recent wellspring, and that I've been really enjoying. And I do think it's another resourcing from a different well. So as you said, breath work, but the act of creation in a um, is a joyous act, and it's so deeply human. I mean, like I went to these caves in Lascaux in the south of France, and the oldest handprint on a wall where somebody had blown ink around it, and these incredible buffalo. And it's like, oh my God, we have been engaging in artistry for not just 2,000 years, 20,000. It's astonishing. And that connection, you talked about awe, Karen, and I'm glad you brought that in because I think staying close to sources of awe is a really important aspect of thriving as well.
Absolutely. Um, so I asked to do this panel and did all the preparation work for it because I am Uchinanchu American, and every May I am celebrating AAPI Heritage Month. So this panel is in honor of AAPI Heritage Month. And so a question that I had is something what do you notice about our AAPI community in the workplace, but also just at the leadership level? And then what do you hope differently for people of our diaspora? Um, Whether that's something hopeful or something you want to see change, however you interpret that question.
I have to laugh and I'd be curious to hear your experience, but thriving was not the family conversation that we had. Survival was the family conversation we had, right? You don't deal with depression or feelings. You just get up and do it. Like, why is this a thing? This shouldn't be a thing. If you had a 96 on a test, what happened to the other 4%? At some point, and I love my mother to little pieces, but at some point I was like, why did I marry such a critical husband? And then I spent 2 days with my mom again. I'm like, oh, right. Like it is a form of love. Thriving is a luxury, at least in my growing up. And which isn't to say that we weren't like I had a family system that was loving and tried to give me everything. But the emotional range was not one that was practiced within my familial set. And so the question of thriving was never even on the table. And that's a particular intersection point about like where I think Chinese culture encountered American culture and particularly American psychology of the late 80s and 90s that I think is a real gift. So I kind of have to laugh at that. Thriving is like, you have three meals on on a table and a safe place, which by the way, do not get me wrong, is not to be underestimated. Like personal safety and security and food and shelter is a wonderful, beautiful, necessary foundational thing that I'm profoundly grateful for. Anything above that, on Maslow's side, like this, like the whole idea of anything related to self-actualization, exploration was not particularly on the table. And so when I think about what I hope is that we can bring range into our interactions, the range of what we can bring into our conversations, speak to, enjoy, all of that is more available so that we get range. I'll pause there because I see our other guest, which I'm delighted to see.
Hi, Makalika. Good morning. I know it's so bright and early for you. How are you this morning?
Oh, I'm just so apologetic, you guys. I'm sorry. I've got everybody's busy. I had a thing and I did not realize we were over time on a different call, but I'm really grateful to be here. So please don't let me interrupt the flow, although maybe that's impossible because I've already done it.
No, you're good. So Makalika, I did want to ask, our first question was, what does thriving mean to you, personally and professionally? And I think we will go from there because I know you'll have a good answer to this.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So by way of introduction, I'm Native Hawaiian. My name is Makalika. I come from two Native Hawaiian families, and I also come from two families that have blended ancestries from other parts of the world. But my work is really focused on Indigenous advocacy and has been for some time. So I'll probably be bringing that mostly into the space. And so with that question, um, well, one way that I increasingly try to think about this is through a lens of Native Hawaiian well-being. So most cultures do have those. Indigenous people are been under a lot of stress on our culture. So actually, I find that we talk about our culture in a more like concrete and consistent manner than a lot of other people do, and I'm self-conscious of that. But partly it's because we have to fight so hard to maintain our culture under colonial pressure, and that includes in this space. So like we are constantly having to start with what does health and well-being mean for us? What does it mean to be well? What does it mean to be good as a Hawaiian person? And actually, we're pretty um, organized about these concepts, like, and we have to be because if we're not, it's really hard to perpetuate that knowledge to our generations and use it in our advocacy. So we have that, and there's not like it's not a set in stone framework, but actually it is pretty specific and like. We've got great thought leaders and organizations I've participated in that have developed this for our entire community. And what that looks like for us is relationships. Those are big. So always like thinking about, am I existing in healthy relationships that help me to get things done that I think are important for my role, and what my traditional knowledge says good Hawaiians should be doing. So that's family relationships for sure. That's relationships with other people in my discipline. So that's a part of our culture too, is that people develop disciplines and then you need to be well connected within that discipline. So that's really important. We also think about something, abundance is really important to us. We don't talk about wealth, but we do talk about abundance. Our word for abundance is vai, which is water, basically twice. So in Hawaiian, water is the term vai. So having abundance for our people is really important. Self-determination, that concept in Hawaiian is called ea. So that I could go on for like quite a while about that, but I guess Karen, like for me, thriving, I try to look at it through a Native Hawaiian lens. Those concepts are actually really specific and well articulated by our people. They are not the same concepts that you see in dominant American, Euro-American culture, but they're not irreconcilable. And those are some examples of what they look like.
I think the common denominator between your answer and Gail's answer is people, and the community that we have built, you have built. And so I really appreciate you saying that. Makalika, I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit more about your Hawaiian cultural practice and how you incorporate that in your law practice. And on a call that we had yesterday, you said that the field of law hasn't changed in centuries. And so I was wondering, how does that look different for you and when you incorporate your Native Hawaiian beliefs, cultures, practices, and all the things?
So there's a lot of, I mean, when people talk about traditional practices in indigenous communities, there's that's at different altitudes. Often the altitudes, because I think even our life ways, right? Like just how do you live your life? Like we take off our shoes before we go into the house, right? Like that's a practice that we have. But there's also, practices at like I would say like capital P practices, which are really a way of saying like what are indigenous jobs, right? So like if you're a healer, like that's a full job, right? Just like being a doctor is a full job. So I want to like set that because that language sometimes can be like used in a way that confuses people because there's practices which are life ways and then there's practices that I think are full on disciplines. So in Hawaii, when you're talking to people about their cultural practices, our minds will first go to big P practices. What's our traditional job? Um, our life ways, because we actually have like what displacement has looked like for Hawaiians is different than a lot of indigenous people on the continent. The little P practices have actually been retained at a really healthy rate because we have maintained them continuously at like a pretty significant amount of the population in Hawaii throughout. So my big P practice, my native job that I've trained in is called Ho'oponopono, which is Native Hawaiian conflict resolution. And just like in a Western system, there's different levels of being credentialed to do that work. So I've studied for 4 years formally with a master in the practice, and that's the way our knowledge is passed down. We do it through like a master apprenticeship. And like the apprentice journeyman kind of, well, that's not the language that we use, but it's a good like framework to think about how that works in Hawaiian culture. So I'm really more at like the journeyman level, not the master level on it. But it marries well with my Western practice as a lawyer, because there's like good correlate, like they are compatible. They're very different though. So yeah, my practice as Ho'oponopono, it's about saying, okay, through a Native Hawaiian lens of wellness, having healthy relationships is very important to being healthy and well. It actually in Hawaiian culture, it doesn't fit under our governance practices, it fits under our healing practices. So that's why like they're different, but they feel similar because lawyers are often involved in resolving disputes, and Ho'oponopono is about resolving disputes. But from a Native Hawaiian lens, resolving the disputes, the goal of that dispute is to take care of you spiritually. And that has very like physical manifestations because if you're not spiritually well, then the way that you will behave is going to have very concrete bad outcomes. But we look at it as a healing practice. So actually, most of my practitioners are not lawyers. Sorry, most of my colleagues in this practice are not lawyers. Most of them are actually social workers or in some other healing practice like counseling, something like that. So that's what we do. And the goal of it is, I mean, Karen, let me know how I can be helpful to answer questions about what that looks like. But I can just tell you that like a lot of Hawaiian practices, it got kind of popularized and sort of lifted out, I think through like the massive amount of tourism that we have in Hawaii. But if people have ever heard of it and they have questions, please let me know because I do think like most indigenous practices, it's been very flattened and oversimplified so far as people have even heard of it. Because people think of it as like when I hear it talked about in the mainstream, it's like, oh, it's about like forgiving people. But that's not quite right. I mean, forgiveness is a very normal outcome of a dispute resolution practice in any culture. We certainly like to see that at the end of a Hawaiian Ho'oponopono practice, but that is not really, I think, a fair way to frame what it's about. But it is about achieving wellness. So I would say that, like, if you walked away with, like, what is that practice? Well, like, that's a great example of difference in culture. Like, dispute resolution, like, I don't think anyone thinks about lawyers as Americans as being a healing practice. Like, I don't think anybody, has that, like, struck you? No, people are laughing, right? Like, no, it's like, that's, like, genuinely laughable. But, like, the analog in Hawaiian culture, like, we sit with the doctors. Yeah.
So something that I was asking Gail right before this is what observations do you have of your Native Hawaiian community that you hope to see differently, or what are some hopes that you have for people of the Native Hawaiian community or diaspora, however you may interpret that?
Wait, sorry, Karen. Say that again. I thought you were asking Gail a question.
No, I was asking Gail this earlier,
Okay.
just in terms of like the AAPI community in general, but I was just going to ask you the same of what have you observed just through your practice and just being a leader in the community of Native Hawaiian community, and what do you hope to see differently? Whether that's something hopeful, whether that's like we were talking about how in the Asian community, we talk a lot about survival rather than thriving. So that's something we would want to see differently for us. I was just curious about on your end.
Like, where do I see the Native Hawaiian community on sort of the spectrum of survival to thriving? Is that
Yeah,
another way to say it?
yeah.
Well, it's funny. Like, I think that's a natural way to build a spectrum. So I don't think that sounds wrong, but I kind of wonder if we're doing both at the same time, which suggests that they're not a spectrum. They're just different things that can be coexisting. Um, because it just depends on the what aspect I'm looking at, right? So I mean, I put the framework by the way in the chat in case people want to go read some materials on how it's laid out. Um, so we definitely think systemically versus linearly. That is like the mode of operating for Hawaiian minds, which actually can be a challenge when we're communicating across difference, right? Is that I think there's some cultures that their default and what they put forward as like good ways of thinking, a good analytical thinker is very linear. And that can be very useful for getting some work done, but it also can miss systems and connections when you think linearly because systems like naturally are more web-like, right? And so our default mode of operating is much more web first. We actually have to fight ourselves to like be linear because in our practice, like our relationship practice is about understanding connectivity. And so you're not going to get us to be like, well, just pretend all these other connections don't exist and think in this straight line, so that we can get this done for this company or for this business objective. Like, that's just not how we're going to work because we're going to know that, like, oh, yeah, you could do this and that would be good for this organization, but then you're shifting a burden over here. And because our communities function as like wellness as a community, like, that is going to be one of our challenges. So one of the things that I think about in your question, Karen, is like if you look at the framework I shared, I think there's times where when you look at individual components, there's a thrive in one area, but like incredible challenges and risk in another area. And so you could feel like you're barely hanging on in one area that's really important and then very strong in these other areas. Um, and at the same time, like we're not going to break them out. So what I hope for Native Hawaiians is that when we achieve wellness throughout the things that we care about because it's not really good enough to just be thriving in one area. Well, for example, we have AO, which is about like our sovereignty, right? We know that you might be able to carve out like positive things on abundance. So let's say, for example, we were ever able to tackle like really bad statistics on Native Hawaiian material health, right? Like that's poverty, that's educational outcomes, that's representation in like the workforce, right? So when you think about abundance, that's one of the ways you can measure abundance. Like you might be able to have some wins on that, but if your sovereignty is under constant threat, like that abundance is going to be short-lived and episodic, right? So that's one way that I think about it. I'm also like one of the more technical Hawaiians that you could have invited to this space. So like there's probably a way to talk about this in a more like poetic way, but like I'm much more in a role of like getting stuff done for my community. And so I'm much more of a technical thinker. So I don't think it's inconsistent with what other people would say. It's just an approach that I have. I like to provide frameworks and ways of thinking. So I would ground us maybe for this talk in our wellness model and if I approached another community, I would do the same. I would be quickly wanting to understand in your community, what is your wellness model? Right? And like how and then what do you need to achieve that wellness model? And that's something that Hawaiians like I think if more people approached Hawaiians rather than trying to understand like what is really a vast and complex culture, frankly, if you more had a grasp on like, well, what does wellness mean to them? And like have they organized that in a way where we could like think about taking a chunk and working through that model, like that would be a more productive approach to the culture. It would be a lot less fun because I think normally the way people approach the culture is like they're trying to understand like practices, right? They want to engage in surfing, they want to engage in hula, they want to engage in like our cloth making practices. Like there's a lot of things that, we produce. And so, like looking at those outcomes of the outputs of the culture and kind of working your way in by like, okay, if I really like watching surfing, maybe I could like learn more about it. Maybe I could practice it. And you're sort of backing into the culture from like the outputs of the culture in one area that catches your fancy. This way is more asking you to like drop into the center of the culture. What is their wellness model, right? Like more in the abstract manner, and then you work your way out and say, okay, if that's what you're trying to achieve, where do I think I could have a role in contributing helpfully to that? And it's a different way of entering in.
Thank you. Gail, I was wondering, you talked very briefly about your Zen practice. I was wondering, is there like a wellness model as well in the Zen practice that you practice?
There is, and I was really appreciating what Makalika said about if your spirit isn't well, then you do things out in the world. And so there is in the Zen practice, we take these vows uh, that are, we take them through a ceremony called Jukai. And the vows are not about how we engage with one another, but they're not from a place that if you violate them, some external person is going to judge you and you're going to hell. Like that's not the way they work. The reason they exist is because Buddha noticed that if you adhered to them, you would just cause less wake in your life. So if you like don't lie to people and don't misuse sexuality and things like that, then your life doesn't cause as much churn in your interactions with others. And so you attend to them in part as a way of, and we talk a little bit about living by vow as opposed to living by karma. Karma being the kind of the grooves of habit and attention and the habitual ways that we tend to move towards pleasure away from pain. And the vows offer, I think, a lovely framework for being a little bit more attentive, mindful, conscious about the way you move through the world and your impact on other people. And I personally like a little bit less wake in my life because it preserves attention for the things that I actually want to attend to, which is the things I care about, my community, my mission, my um, uh, the care I have for the world.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to ask both of you, what does it look like for someone to be an ally of the AAPI diaspora and community? How can other people support our thriving in wellness?
A couple of quick things. One, I love people who are curious, and even just the variety of people who've shown up on this call, like how delightful that you're here. Um, Two, I think that I pay a lot of attention to geopolitics and have some very good friends who are journalists in Asia. And as this war, Cold War right now is heating up with China, we have not historically been a culture in America in particular that has been making differentiations. I mean, if you think about the rise in attacks on like brown people of all stripes after 9/11, the inability to distinguish the mass judgment, the hysteria that got whipped up around AI about COVID and communities, the violence against Asians in San Francisco, we have not been good at discernments. And so I think that is a thing that's going to be even more necessary in the coming generation because we don't know what's heating up where, but things are definitely heating up. I just want to place that futural concern into the shared space because I think that will definitely have a potential impact. I'd like to believe better of the world, but Japanese internment camps does not, make me hopeful. So I just want to note that as a cautionary flag.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about allyship for any community, actually, this is not specific to Native Hawaiians, because I also have to do a lot of work to be a good ally to other communities too, right? So it's like while I advocate for advocacy for mine, I'm thinking about how to be a good ally for others or advocate for allyship. It's like two directional. Um, so I always think that the best allies are people who have internalized into their worldview that the success of that community is actually good for them. Right? Like if you think that like you're doing something as a gift to someone else, as an act of charity for somebody else, that's not gonna work. Like it just won't be long standing, right? And you won't be as impactful, right? So like I wonder too, like Gail, I wish I knew more. Buddhism has actually like been embraced in Hawaii, like by our leadership during the monarchy days. And so like I have participated in some Buddhist practices, but I wish I was a better scholar. But I kind of wonder in the vein of enlightenment, what like enlightenment, um, how that leans into this. Like, but I think there probably is a connection where it's like an enlightened person understands that like there is a shared good, and that we need to like internalize that and say, okay, like this tribalism that has been, you could I think tribalism at some level is actually a disease that's affecting us in a bad way and like has created literally 500 years of badness on this planet. And so the sooner that we can, I think right now we're on a trajectory of like, well, we're gonna leave that enlightened thinking to whoever survives. Like like we're trying to let one tribe win this and then they can decide to be enlightened. Like, so I don't, but actually it's like, look, if you could actually embrace, and one of the things that I love about, so tourism in Hawaii is a very complicated topic, because it really affects my people's wellness and it's tens of millions of people a year. So like for what's really a small space, it's not a very big land area, for that amount of tourism. So anyways, but if people have come, I'm delighted because I think when you come, people regularly say it affords them, maybe just because of the geographic isolation and then the distinctiveness of our culture, an opportunity to investigate what enlightenment means for them, to investigate these concepts of, maybe there is a shared good. Like maybe we can put down the tribalism because Hawaii is also one of the most diverse states in the country, like in the sense that not how many different cultural groups are represented, although we probably rank well in that regard. But in the sense that like we don't have a majority ethnic group in Hawaii. We are a state of just minorities. And so because of that, like everybody has to kind of like see across difference, like because there's not one that's just going to get what they want. All the groups like have to work cooperatively. So that's something that I think would be really helpful for people to think about in any realm of allyship is like, am I coming at this as if their success is actually what's good for me? Like, and if I believe that, then now you're doing it for you. And it's not to trigger a sense of selfishness, but it's to trigger something enduring and something that will be persistent in you when it's not easy. Because it won't be easy. Of course it won't, because they think really differently than you. And like Hawaiians in particular, I say like our challenge is pretty like when I have to talk across difference, I mean, I have an argument that like it's probably harder for our people than maybe any other people on the planet because we were truly isolated for centuries. So like only in the Pacific do people like we see a lot of kinship, but there wasn't a lot of migrating between like Europeans did not know that Hawaii existed until the very late 1700s, right? And so like the journey of understanding the way that we see the world, like it's one of the longest journeys you have to make with Hawaiians because it just wasn't a part. Like when you look at like, for example, in English, you can see how peoples were connected through all the different cultures that are deeply embedded in English, right? Like and I'm discovering it all the time. Like the word paradise comes from Persian, like Persia, right? Like that. So like people think, oh yeah, of course, definitely English is a combination of like the British Isles, France. You also see a lot of Spanish getting in there. But I mean, you find words in English from all different parts of these interconnected continents, which tells you that people have been having cultural exchange and understanding each other at some level for centuries and centuries and centuries. But, even then, there's such differences that it's going to be hard. So
Mhm.
for whatever you can do, like it's just going to be really easy to quit if you don't think about it that way.
Right. Um, yes, Gail, I really appreciated what you said about that first step is curiosity, asking the question, doing the research, and just being open-minded. I think is a really great way to start that allyship or step into that. I wanted to transition over to audience Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat for our panelists. But yes, so I think we did have a question up somewhere in the beginning.
We have a good conversation going over in the Q&A, as far as people just kind of punctuating things that really are speaking to them. And one of the questions I know I have. If anyone else has a question, please put it in the Q&A. One of the questions I had for Makalika, you and Gail, is how your the worldview that you're describing, how does it affect how you lead?
So one of the things that is distinctively different about Native Hawaiian leadership compared to Western American leadership, which is how I was actually trained formally as a leader. So like I was raised in the diaspora. I was trained formally, organizationally in dominant Western organizations, big corporations, and law firms. And so I actually come with more hours spent being told how to be that kind of leader. Something that is really different about Native Hawaiian leadership, like operating in a Native Hawaiian dominant space, is that like framework of health and wellness that I put out there is embedded. It's embedded in our way of thinking. And so how does that look different? Well, organizationally, we're a lot less likely to just push burdens on other organizations or people. So in like organizational problem solving in the Western world, people are like, this is my organization, this is what I want to achieve. I'm going to find hopefully legally compliant ways to do that. And if that necessarily means that I'm pushing burdens on other people to achieve that, that's somebody else's problem. Like, hopefully, they've done their own work with some legislature to protect them from whatever that is, because the only guardrails I am going to function under are legal ones. Other than that, it's fair game, and I'm here to win, and we're going to get that done. And Native Hawaiians do not generally do that because we're also very interconnected. That relationship piece is super key. And so we know, like, yeah, that we're going to do that, but that's going to have a ripple effect. And that's just going to become that other organization's problem. And that's not okay. Right? Like, you can't just, for example, like in the criminal justice space, like as an example, people like, oh, I've got this problem. Like, I was just involved in a discussion about like what's the future of our police department on Oahu. And we had all these stakeholders in the room, and they had the chambers of commerce in the room. And the chambers of commerce, maybe unsurprisingly, were basically like, how are you going to make it so that people come and shop at our stores more? Which is basically a veiled way of saying, how are you going to lock all these people up like faster? Because homelessness and theft are like a problem for us. And like we're not going to the Department of Ed and the Department of Commerce and asking them how they're going to fix this problem by creating like employment opportunities and better educational opportunities. We're advocating at the police department for how you need to be locking these people up, right? Like, and not thinking about how by coming to that space for that kind of advocacy versus those other spaces, what you're doing is shifting this burden in a lot of different directions. You're asking us to build more jails that's going to affect somebody's neighborhood. You're asking us to have all the collateral damage that's going to affect these jailed people's families, right? But like, I'm just here to figure out how I get more people shopping in my store. So I'm going to go with the quickest possible option for that. And that's going to shift burdens in other places instead of me stepping back and saying, you know what? You know what the Chamber of Commerce should be doing? If I have a homelessness problem, I need to be figuring out how do I get more programs to fix homelessness. The problem for homelessness is not jailing people, right? So like that's just one example. We could do more. I chose to pick that one because I just have been thinking about it over the last couple days. Um, but we think systemically. It's hugely different. We do not think about just like the compartment that we're in because we live in a community.
Beautiful. I love that. It's interesting. We've been supporting leaders and thinking systemically for literally decades now, and it's so difficult for some people to get out of the worldview of silos into this kind of wider purview. So I really appreciate that. That's just core to your being, core to your being. Gail, I wonder about you. How does, as you described, especially you brought up concepts in here about interbeing and how our fate is bound in each other. How does it affect your leadership or how you
I,
think about leadership?
I think there's a mutually reinforcing cycle. One of the jokes, I said I was on my way to becoming a monk when I became an executive instead. And I think where I became an executive mattered, which is Wikipedia. So when I was there, we ran Wikipedia in 290 different languages, each with their own governance structure. And that is a system that was tremendously about interdependence, fundamentally. You had a backbone of technology committed to free knowledge for the world. And it would look different. Farsi Wikipedia is run differently than German Wikipedia, which is run differently than Japanese Wikipedia. And so you had these different interconnected things. And so this concept of interdependence and influence rather than dictation. I mean, there was some common shared values around commitment to free knowledge. Like there's a value set that lies underneath things that I think is important to discover in any endeavor that you're a part of. But what lives on top of that and how you collaborate, because the scale of the issue, bringing at the time for Wikipedia, the sum total of human knowledge to make available to anyone from everywhere for free is so large that no one institution could do that. We weren't trying to own free knowledge, it's an NGO for a reason. We were trying to collaborate with galleries, libraries, archival institutions, et cetera, because the mission was so big that no one person could do the lift. And I still believe that about a lot of things we do. And so I find it laughable on some level that we have these concepts of ownership in some ways. Like, I like to own a nice thing as much as anyone else. But around ideas, like there's so many, and I also believe very much in caring for the commons. Like, and Wikipedia was a variation of that, but I still think the commons is incredibly important to care for. And I think as a countervailing force to privatization, which is so much a part of the capitalistic structures we're in, I think caring for the commons is a really important thing for all of us to do, and that we can define that in a whole host of ways.
Gail, thank you for the Wikipedia example because that's so pragmatic and it's something that every one of us has been touched by or touched or used as a resource in some way. That's a fabulous frame of it, practical example. I know Karen's going to be closing us soon, but I was in charge of the questions today. So one more question, I think, is from Angela. Angela, you just want to ask your question?
Yep. Again, I'm always, whenever I have conversations like this, looking to find ways in my life to continue thinking about these topics. So I would love to hear book recommendations. What's on your nightstand, or what do you think should be on our nightstand? And you may interpret that however you wish, whether it is a serious thought piece or perhaps a bit of joy in these times.
I do love Braiding Sweet Dress. It is really good. I was trying to think about Asian American authors, and I not not finding one immediately coming to mind. I was just thinking about the line from like Wendell Berry's "Be joyful, even though you have considered all the facts." For me, that's one that consistently comes up. Like, what is it? Also, like Jack Gilbert's line from a Brief from the Defense, where he talks about how we must risk delight to make injustice the only measure of our attention is to praise the devil. And so for me, it's less books that are coming to mind than like some of the lines of poetry that have been my mainstays over the decades. And I just started pulling them together, which I've been really enjoying. And just going to put the website here on because I just started putting the poetry that's meant a lot to me, that have said things with commentary on them, that I've been just really enjoying. So that's a little offering for you if you want it. Poems that I have loved and that has guided me, and the way that I think about the world.
It's super funny because that question I kind of love it because I try to go to independent bookstores frequently. I will never go into one without leaving with a book, and usually more than one. And they basically become decorative piles of like evidence of my lack of leisure time all over my house. So there's literally a pile right here by my camera, but like there's nothing special about this pile compared to any of the other piles in this space. But I can share them. I mean, so I think there's like kind of two themes for me on books for what it's worth. One, like I think as a like there's just so much history, you can never know all the history. That's why I wasn't joking about Wikipedia because I frequently go on there and then there's a link and then I'm like, oh, I need to know that as broader context. And then, you're just link. And like last night, I for some reason like got down a deep hole on like the Swinton family. I don't know, that actress from England, and like I learned way more about her family than I needed to because I just was trying to learn something about a movie that I once watched. But anyway, so I think it's helpful to know. I try to learn more history because I believe that my generation was sold a bunch of bad history. So I spend a lot of time trying to get the true context into which I now am expected to pick up the baton of leadership with my classmates. Hawaii talks in classmates, right? So everyone my vintage, like we're all like classmates on this planet, and we're sold a bunch of lies about the status of the world and the historical context for that world. And so now here we are middle-aged, actually trying to do a good job, but that means we need to read a bunch of books to educate ourselves because a lot of what we were taught was just straight lies. So you'll see like there's one category of books in my house that is about like actually understanding the history of the world in America and around the world. There's also a forward thinking, like we've got big problems that seem, in some ways, they're actually not new. In some ways, technology is making them seem new. And so there's also a line of like, how do I understand what experts are thinking we should do? So like I've got The Age of Extraction by Tim Wu, and it's talking about like, what do we need to do about the internet and AI? The Law of Capitalism and how to transform it, right? Like indigenous people talk a lot about how capitalism is bad. A lot of people can't really articulate what they mean by that and what they want to do about it. So like trying to figure out like what the great thinkers are thinking about the solutions to our problems is one thing. And then I also just really love simple stories. So Gail, when you were saying Asian American authors, I also couldn't lift up one by name, so that's a shame on me, I guess, too. But I have been like really enjoying easy to fairly easy to read novels from especially Korea and Japan that have we've been fortunate to have translated, right? So I think one of the things like I really like is just stories about the lived experience. Like I read one that was talking about it was basically the story of a woman who opened an independent bookstore in South Korea. And like the story was about like what brought her to that, her different employees. And through that, I got insight as to basically a lot of challenges in their economy, how they were thinking about what their opportunity was as young professionals and like how grateful they just were after exhausting early 20s and teenage years in this like crazy competitive system to get corporate jobs, how relieved they were to just basically give up and just toil away in a little bookstore. And that just taught me a lot about like where they were at, like so I also there's a vein of things that like I just like I don't need like crazy uh conspiracy theory thriller books. Like I really like books where like just tell me what there's another book I just picked up and it's all about like being a delivery guy in China. Right? That there's this massive workforce that is like kind of invisible that what they do is they're the DoorDash people, right? Like they and like that experience. So those would be my three buckets. I don't think there's really one.
I am in the same boat. I have so many buckets of books and so many books that I need to read on my list. But thank you so much to our panelists, Makalika and Gail. I greatly appreciate your time and wisdom today. And as we close out, everyone, please share a thank you in the chat or come off on your microphone. But thank you so much for joining us today. A recording will be sent out to our Wisdom Works community. Thank you, everyone.